Welcome to the Flex Rental Solutions webinar. Today we're going to be talking about event folders and how you can use event folders to better organize the jobs in your system. To create a new event folder, just go over to the New menu and then click New Event Folder. You're just going to be inputting some simple information here. So for example, the show name, the start and end date of the entire show. Let's say this is going to be about a week long. And then there's some other information very similar to what you might enter into a quote. Department, referral sources, if you want to put that information. We could put the client in there. Let's just choose Chris. A venue. So really just general information about the job. You'll notice too that it starts in the tentative status. And as we get closer to the end of the webinar, we'll start looking at some settings for the event folder and how you can change that if you want the initial status. We'll click Accept, and we'll now have an event folder created. So an event folder really just works like a folder on your computer. As you're looking through files, you can store all of your different files in different folders. You're essentially doing the same exact thing here in Flex. And so all an event folder is really is just that general information that you included here. And we will be able to print out some reports for the event folder that will include the child elements and child quotes. And then there's also some really cool job costing information that we could look at too once we've started adding quotes to this event folder. But for the most part, all the event folder is just a folder that houses some very basic information, and then we can start adding child elements to the event folder. Now I imagine that most people would probably be adding primarily quotes as direct children to the event folder. A few things that you'll notice when I hit Add New Quote down here at the bottom. It inherits the warehouse, it inherits the client, it inherits the venue. It did not inherit the dates. There are a few settings for that I want to look at really quick. So let's just cancel out of that new quote. And let's go to Projects, Project Elements. And we're going to double click and open the quote, Project Elements. And the few things that we want to look at really quick. Number one, we want to go to the contact associations. And we want to look at the inherited field here. And so you can see that quite a few of these things are inherited. So client's inheriting, the venue is inheriting, even responsible person, corporate identity, business location, if these are some of the things that you have set up in your system. But all of those are inheriting from a parent. So, because the quote is inheriting, that's why when I went to create a new quote or add a quote as a child to this event folder, why those things inherited. So if you don't want those things to inherit, then you can just go to your quotes, project element settings, and one place you'll look is that contact associations and just make sure inherited is set to no. Another place you'll want to look where there's a lot of these different fields is your field settings. So different fields can be enabled and you can choose whether or not those fields inherit from the parent. The other option here that you might have seen is whether or not you can override. So we see that here on the field settings. We saw that over here on contact associations. That just means that if this were set to no, if the quote was inheriting all of these fields and this was set to no, then you wouldn't be able to change that on a quote. You notice when I went to add a new quote from the event folder, sure it inherited, but I also can change those things if I want. A lot of times it's good to keep that the override enabled turned to yes. Because, for example, what if I'm doing a job that is primarily going to be at this venue, but I have one quote for maybe an off-site party that's going to be happening at a Hilton or a smaller venue. So you might want to be able to override and change that venue. So for the most part, I like to keep that override enabled set to yes. You might have some reasons why you have it set to no so that people couldn't override it, but that's just up to you. Last place I want to look really quick though is this dates and times. Notice that my dates inherited is set to no, which is why when I added that quote to the event folder, the dates did not populate. So you can set that to yes so that the dates and times will populate on the quote, but I like to set that to no. Because again, I might be adding a new quote to this event. Remember, the whole event runs almost an entire week. But I might have maybe breakout rooms. And I could name this whatever I want. I usually like to do specifically what this quote is and then keep the show name in there from the event folder, but you can do that however you want. But if I'm doing breakout rooms that might only run for a couple days, then that gives me the option to choose those dates without having them auto-filled in, and notice that my dates were also required. So when I didn't have anything there, it won't even let me create this quote until I actually fill in a date. So that's one reason why you might have the dates and times not inherit, just because you want to prompt whoever's adding that new quote to put in the proper dates for that specific job. So I just click accept, and now I have a quote that's been created, and you can see that it's housed in this event folder now. I could go back to the event folder and add another quote. Let's say that this is going to be the closing party. And again, you don't have to follow this structure of naming. You can really name it whatever you want. I just kind of like doing a dash event name. And maybe the closing party will be just that Sunday. Again, I could go in here and change any of this information. Just because it's inheriting doesn't mean that I can't change the venue if I want to. And I could also add all the other specific information for a quote. Just for the sake of time, I'm not going to do that right now, but just know that you can do that per quote so that you have all that information for each quote. Now I'm just going to quickly add a few items to these quotes. We're not really going to be talking about how to build quotes and best practices there. I just want to add a few items so that we can get some pricing on these quotes. And then we can eventually go down and look at the job costing for an event folder. So now that I've actually added some items to these quotes and they have prices now, when I go back to the event folder and click this job costing, it's now showing me the different quotes, the planned revenue, expenses, and the profit loss. These expenses will actually pull from all of the different child elements that might be created either directly underneath the event folder or as a child to the quote. So for example, let's say, and it looks like I have quite a conflict here, if I need to maybe create a PO to fulfill or to resolve that conflict. Let's say that I'm going to do a subrental. Let's find a vendor that we could get that from. So now as a child to the quote, we have a PO, and that's pretty basic stuff. A lot of you have probably done this in the past, and you understand how that works. But the reason I wanted to show this is now we have a PO that has costs associated with it, or at least it doesn't yet. Let me add a cost. So for this receiver, let's just say maybe we get them for not 10, but maybe $100 or $200. So again, now when I go back to the parent event folder, even though that PO is a child of the quote, it still is considered in the job costing for the entire event folder. So now we can see that expense that's coming from the PO. Now this isn't a great example of how the job costing tab works. I haven't really built out this show, so there's not much revenue planned. The expenses far outweigh that, so I wouldn't say this is a great example of what a job should look like, but I just wanted to show you how these different revenues and expenses appear in the job costing tab of an event folder. One thing to keep in mind about this job costing tab, for revenue planned is going to be anything that appears on a quote. Actuals are going to be anything that appears on an invoice. So once I go back and actually create an invoice for one of these quotes, and let's just do that really quick. We'll go through the process, we'll confirm first, and then we'll generate the invoice. What you'll notice now, both on the quote and on the event folder, on that job costing, we'll see both a planned and an actual. Same thing with expenses. If I happen to put anything as an expense, like if I go to a quote and look at my profit markup view and put some costs into this cost field here, that would show up in the job costing as planned expenses. Actual expenses are going to be expenses that show up on invoices, POs, and things like that. So we have a couple videos about how this job costing tab works. If you want to learn a little bit more about it and some of the best practices in setting that up, then you can view some of those videos. We're not going to talk about it too much here. I just wanted to show you how an event folder's job costing tab works with all of the different child elements that show up here. So I could very well have 15 quotes. Each quote has 3 POs. Maybe the event folder just has 2 or 3 general POs that are just direct children of the event folder. I could just add a purchase PO directly to the event folder. And after all of that, and after all of those are built with revenue and expenses, all of that will show up on the job costing tab. Another really cool thing about event folders is that you can print reports that will aggregate the child elements. So for example, one that you'll probably use quite often would be the quote subreport aggregation. So let's click on that, choose the subreport that I want. So maybe I want it to print out all of the quotes with quote with pricing look A. So now I have a single document, a single PDF that has printed out each quote that's a child of that event folder. Another really cool thing you can do with event folders is, by default, the Generate PDF in your project element settings. Let's just look at that really quick. So project elements for event folder. If we look at the default print format report on the Reports tab, this is what happens when you hit Generate PDF. And so by default, we have it set up to print out a budget summary followed by the quote subreport aggregation that will just print the default financial document. So what that looks like, let's go back to our event folder and just hit Generate PDF. Now you can see we have a single PDF, but first it prints out a nice event budget summary agreement. That's going to show each quote that you have, what the cost is and what the grand total is going to be. And then it has a little signature block if you want that as well. And then it's going to attach each individual quote that's a child of that event folder. So again, that comes from the Generate PDF action. And to change what happens when you hit Generate PDF, you just go to Projects, Project Elements, and then look at the event folder on the Reports tab. One best practice that I've seen, a lot of our customers will do something like this where they will build a nice stack of reports that prints out with just that single Generate PDF action. So first, they might go in and upload a static report, which might just be maybe a nice flashy looking cover page that they have with their company name and photos and maybe some some marketing material. So you can upload just a static PDF. And then you could use that once it's uploaded. Just go to the report section here and say, I want to use whatever that static PDF was. Choose it, click add, and that will add it to this list. And then you can drag and drop which order those will print in. And so I've seen some of our customers that will say, first I want to print our fancy splash page. Then I want to print the budget summary agreement look D. Then I want to print the quote subreport aggregation, which is going to take all of the quotes under that event folder. You could even choose which report prints as that subreport aggregation. So maybe I don't want the default financial document. Maybe I want it to print quote with pricing look B. So when I add it to this default print format report, I'm going to choose not quick quote, my mistake, the quote subreport aggregation, and the subreport, the one that it's going to print each quote in, is going to be quote with pricing look B. And then you might say, I also want to end with terms and conditions look A, or just the default terms and conditions, or look B, whatever. So let's click Update and see what this looks like now. If we go back to our event folder, click Generate PDF, the things that we're going to notice that are different are not the cover page, because we didn't change anything here, but the quote look is different. It's no longer printing just the default financial document. It's actually printing the subreport that we told it to. And at the very end, it's printing our terms and conditions. And it looks like I don't have a terms and conditions document uploaded for whatever location or corporate identity I'm using for this event folder. But that's okay. A lot of you probably already have that set up. Flex support would have helped you set that up when you first started with Flex. So if you do have some default terms and conditions loaded, then that last page would print out those terms and conditions. But you can see how useful this can be to be able to build that generate PDF up just so that it can print out a bunch of different things at once as a nice little packet that you can send off to your client so that they could see that nice summary, each quote, and then terms and conditions. Let's look at a couple of the other child elements that you can add to an event folder, and then we'll move into looking at a little bit of workflow and some higher level settings for event folders before we finish. These are just all of the default elements that you can add to an event folder. And most of them that you would use are there. The quote, maybe you're just adding a direct invoice that you didn't quote first, it's just an invoice for a hard cost. Expense sheets are always a good one too. I often find that the expense sheet is a little bit underused throughout our Flex customer base. The expense sheet's a really great way to just add in some quick expenses that are associated with a job, like maybe parking. And I could add it to a certain resource type. If there's a vendor, purchase order, invoice number, etc., I could add all that. But let's just say that it's just a one-time expense. And that's just a single expense sheet that's a child of the event folder. And again, all of these expenses are going to show up on the job costing tab. Notice we now have the $30 transportation charge. And so that's just one of the many child elements that you can add. If you have maybe a custom element, or maybe if there's an element that you want to be able to add to an event folder but you don't see it here. Again, let's just look at the project element settings for the event folder. This one's pretty simple. You just go to child elements and just check off whatever you want to be able to add to an event folder. For example, I know one of our customers, and maybe other customers do it as well, they actually put event folders inside of event folders. So they might check that as a permitted child element. And once you do that, just make sure you click Update and then reload any event folders you have open. But now I can actually add another event folder underneath this event folder. The reason for that might be, just going back to the company I know that does this, they do jobs that are just so incredibly massive that they needed a better way to organize all of the different quotes. So, for example, they might be doing a large convention for several $1,000,000, and so each quote would be just a huge quote, both financially and just per line item. And so what they would do is say the event folder parent is just going to be the general information, what the show name is, and then they would add an event folder for a specific event that's happening under that parent event. So for example, this might be the general session event. We could give that very specific dates. It looks like I don't have the inherit settings on my event folder, so I would have to fill that in again, but I could go back to my event folder settings and just say that client and venue are inherited from a parent. And so now I have an event folder under an event folder, and from this child event folder, I could start adding quotes, like a quote for video, a quote for audio, a quote for lighting, a quote for labor, all for the general session. And then I might go back to the parent event folder, add another event folder for breakouts. And then I would have underneath that child event folder a quote for breakout audio, a quote for breakout video, etc. So I realize a lot of you probably won't need to do that just because it just depends on the size of job that you're doing. But I know that customer specifically, if they weren't utilizing that event folder and event folder as child scheme, then they would literally have about 50 to 60 different quotes and different elements underneath that one event folder. So it just works as a really good way for them to further organize what they're doing inside of the event folder. Let's look at just a couple other things before we get to workflow and settings. First, what if you've already created a quote, but then you want to create an event folder and put that quote into it? You don't want to have to delete the quote or rebuild it. So what we can do, and let's just go find one of my other quotes that I've built recently. This one doesn't belong to any project tree right now. All I have to do from that quote is just click Move, click the little pencil, and that will let me choose an event folder to move it to. So here's the name of the event folder. I'll verify that it's an event folder. I don't want to move it to underneath a quote or a rental PO. I want to move it to underneath this. So I'll double click that, click Move, and now I have that quote showing up in the project tree for that event folder. So you can do that with quotes, POs, anything. Just use that move option to move it to wherever you need it to go. So one thing you might notice, and we talked about this right when we created the event folder, it started in the tentative status. And from there you can either cancel or confirm the event. If you want to modify the workflow, you'll go to Projects, Workflow, and you'll find the event workflow here. Again, I'm not going to go through all of the different things you can do with workflow. We recently did a webinar on that, actually. You could find, probably just in the past 3 or 4 weeks, you could find that video on our YouTube page. But that's how you can find the event workflow, so that if you do want to make some changes to that workflow, then you can do that here. A couple quick things that I will look at, though. Say, for example, if you were to cancel an event from the tentative state, or if you're canceling it from the confirmed state, what do you want to happen to all of the quotes that are directly underneath it? So let's click this workflow action. This is where you might utilize a chained child action. So if I cancel an event folder, let's find our quote workflow. We'll also want to cancel the quote. Keep in mind, you're going to see several different versions of cancel quote. It doesn't matter which one you use. All this is representing is you probably have 3 or 4 ways to cancel a quote, whether it's from tentative, confirmed, etc. So that's just representing the different ways that you can cancel a quote from the quote workflow. It doesn't really matter which one you choose. As long as you choose one, click Add to add it to the chain child actions, and then click Update. So now if I cancel this event, all those quotes underneath it should also cancel. And there's a few considerations there. What if you confirm an event? Do you want all of the quotes to confirm with it? Yes or no? Probably not. If you confirm an event, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single quote is officially confirmed. You might still have a few things in there that the client is still not 100% sure on. So I would say when it comes to the event workflow and chaining child actions, then you probably only want to stick with those child actions on canceling an event. And if there happens to be a single quote from that event folder that's still happening, you can open that quote, move it out, and then reconfirm it. And so there's a couple places to look if you want to change the default state. Remember, we're talking about states and we're talking about statuses. The default state is tentative, and you would change that from the workflow. But if you want to change the default status, then you would go to Project Elements, Event Folder, and then look at the status options. And that's where you would change what the default status is going to be. A lot of times it's just going to match. The state will be tentative, the status will be tentative. I would say for the most part, most of our customers just keep it as tentative. Reason being is because you're not necessarily putting any inventory into an event folder. You're putting inventory on quotes, and quotes are going to start in their initial state, which is typically like your inquiry or something that doesn't create conflicts yet until you confirm it. So the fact that the event folder starts in tentative isn't too big of a deal because you don't really have inventory on the event folder, so you're not going to have any conflict issues. But if you do want to change the workflow initial state and the status, then you saw how we can do that. Let's just look at a couple other settings for your event folders. Again, we're going to go to Projects menu, Project Elements, double-click Event Folder. There's a few higher level settings that you might want to look at as well. First of all, if you don't even see event folders in your system, then you might want to go to that project element list, see if you even have it created, and if you do, double-click on it and just make sure that it's enabled yes. And once you do that, you'll also want to say Show on New Element menu yes, so that you can come over here and actually create a new one from here. But that would be one of the biggest settings. If you can't see the event folder, you might want to look at these top-level settings here. You also have a lot of the same settings that you have with your other elements. You can look in our user manual for a little bit more information on some of these. You'd notice that when I created the event folder, there wasn't a lot of these field settings. So for example, you didn't see load-in date, you didn't see show date, and things like that. So if you do want those fields, you just come in here and enable them. And after any change you make, just click Update. You could change the numbering scheme of your event folders. Right now I just don't have one at all, so you'll notice there's no numbering, there's just a name. We already looked at status options, child elements. You could change which reports are enabled to be run from an event folder. Right now we only have a few of these aggregation ones, but you can enable more of them if you want. We looked at contact associations a little bit as well. Which one of these do you want enabled on your event folder? Security settings, like who can view an event folder, who can edit an event folder. Typically, you'll probably just leave most of these unchecked, which means that anybody can access it. And then a big one here too is the dates and times. Do you want to change what the default start time is? By default, it's 4:01 p.m. I'm not entirely sure why we chose that, but probably just a random number. But if you want to change, when you create a new event folder, what those times default to, then you can just change that right here. Then click Update. And then you can also add custom fields. There's a really good webinar on our YouTube page about this if you're interested in that. And changing the search options, which are the columns that appear when you go to Projects, Event Folders to search for event folders. You could change those just right there on the Search Options tab. And again, we have a good webinar on that on our YouTube page if you're interested in learning more about what this does. So those are event folders. Hopefully this was helpful to you and gave you some good ideas on how you can use event folders in your system. There's a lot of good experimenting you can do with them and just how you organize, whether you do like event folders within event folders, things like that. The last thing that I'll show you though is just on the calendar, the way that event folders show up. And so right here I have the event, and then I also have this option to show parent elements only. Now since I canceled this event, it looks like all of the quotes were canceled as well, so it's not showing them underneath. But if I had live quotes under here, there would just be a little drop down arrow that will show all of those different elements underneath the event folder. And clicking show parent elements only would just take that all up into the single line. You could still expand if you want, but a lot of times people like to have that checked just so when they initially open up their calendar, it's not a gigantic mess showing every single element inside of an event folder. So if you do have any best practices or things that you wouldn't mind sharing in terms of how you use event folders in your system, you can always go to our forum at forum.flexrentalsolutions.com. On our webinars board, we have the specific post about this webinar, and you can respond there, start a discussion there. But of course, we have a bunch of other boards that you could post to as well. If you have any issues with your event folders, anything more technical in nature, then you can email support@flexrentalsolutions.com.